System.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming and games through a feminist lens. Today, I'm your host, Alex, and I'm joined by my friends Jem and Matt. Before we get started, if you want to support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gaming the system for some exclusive content. Or you can send us a one-off donation via PayPal to our email address, wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com. We are back for another couple of episodes, and we're going to revisit a topic that we've discussed previously on the pod, and that is about disability and disability representation in gaming. So what I want to do with this first part is kind of revisit the topic in broad terms. So just think about disability as a whole in gaming, what that says about our perceptions of disability and how it's kind of represented in different ways and all sorts of things like that. And then part 2 is going to be about a really recent release to a T, which is made by the developers of the game Stray, Annapurna Interactive. And they've also made a number of other popular games as well. So we'll talk more about that in part 2. So I want to start off with just an overview for people who might be curious about what disability is and might not have perhaps the knowledge of what disability is. So when we talk about disability, we mean a condition that someone has. It can be physical, mental, visible or invisible, but it's something that impacts upon a person's day-to-day and perhaps limits certain daily activities. Under the Equality Act, you have to have had that condition for a year or more to be legally defined as disabled. And so disability really covers quite a broad spectrum of lots and lots of different health conditions. They might be long-term things, or they might be less long-term, then they often fluctuate. And the majority of disability, I think around 83% of people who are disabled were not born with their disability as well. So they might acquire their disability, and I use the phrase with a slight hint of tongue-in-cheek to it. They might acquire their disability later in life, and the older we get, the more likely we are to become disabled as well. Additionally, also, you can have multiple conditions all at once, so you don't just have one condition and that's your lot. You can have multiple conditions, you can have one condition that leads to another condition, all sorts of different things, and they all intersect in lots of different ways. And equally, disability affects anyone, no matter who you are, where you're from, what age you are, what your background is. It's kind of the largest minority group when we think about it in those terms. And right now we're living in a world that is designed for non-disabled people. And so myself, as a disabled woman, I'm kind of working to kind of correct some of that and try and make people more aware of accessibility and accessible and inclusive ways of making the world a little more welcoming to disabled people and accepting of disabled people. So that's kind of a broad overview of disability and kind of where I sit within it. I have lived experience as a wheelchair user myself, and I know that you guys also have lived experience or by proxy experience of disability yourselves as well. So that's where we're coming from this discussion, and we don't speak for everyone who's disabled, we only speak from our lived experience as well. So with that overview done and dusted, I would like to ask you both, how common do you think that disability representation is based on your gaming history within the games that you've played?
I think that, I think it isn't very common. Any sort of, certainly severe disability is uncommon. I think minor disabilities, I say that, I mean, what is minor. I have hearing loss and have to wear hearing aids, and in some ways it's extremely minor. I mean, I can get by and it's not a problem, but in other circumstances it can be really problematic. So I think, when I say minor, I mean in a very broad term, but yes, minor things like people wearing glasses or hearing aids or walking with a limp and things like that. So I think they're quite common in games, but usually not as a protagonist, usually as a side character, rarely a playable character. So I think mental health issues and disabilities are probably more common in games because they can often provide a good motivator or plot driving tool. But yeah, physical disability, I think, is quite rare in games. But I do think we are seeing a little bit more as time goes on. So I'm hoping that there's, I think it's getting better.
Definitely,
But
I think
it's by no means representative of the numbers of people, living in our societies with disabilities.
I think it would be super interesting if there was like a study of like the percentage of disabled characters based on the genre of game as well. Because if you think about certain environments, like say a game with a lot of monsters, you might have a lot of people who have limb differences because they've been attacked by monsters.
Absolutely,
like
yeah.
There's all sorts of ways it can sort of manifest itself. But yeah, there's a study out there for someone who wants to look into it, definitely. What about you, Matt? How common do you think it is based on your gaming history?
I think it's tricky to assess that, because I'm glad you started off talking with a refresher on what disability is, because it's another one of those things where it's not a simple concept for things to be, and it means different things to different people, and people can, like you say, Jem, what is a minor disability, what's minor to some people is a massive deal to others, and I think it comes in with a sort of there's the toxic element of people having something in their life that on paper counts as a disability, but they don't. It's hard to say that about yourself. It's like you can pass for not being disabled. If it can be invisible, you can hide it.
And I think there's a lot of stigma behind the wish to sometimes hide it as well. Because that's what society tells you, is that disability is something to perhaps be afraid of or be ashamed of even, because we all want to fit in. And so we all think, well, actually, no, I'll be okay if I just try and fit in and maybe mask some of this stuff. Because if I look like this or behave in this way, everyone will think that I'm normal and we can all get on just fine. But yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma attached to identifying as disabled, and it's a massive hurdle for a lot of people to get over that internalized ableism and also external ableism as well.
Yeah. So there's that challenge with it of you can retroactively, or you can say to, like, every character that you'll play is meant to be the powerful character that is in command of themselves and their environment, and you're the one that shapes the world through what your character can do, and you can retrofit disabilities onto that. You can say that they've got mental health stuff or some sort of physical stuff, but then when the way that character moves through the world, it's exactly the same as if they didn't have any. And that's the sort of the cut-off point where I'm thinking, if you're including a disability, so one of the most common ones, which we'll talk about in a bit, is prosthetic limbs. They've been used forever. So you're like, oh no, you've lost your arm, and now you've got this extra cool, awesome new arm that can do more cool things. That doesn't, it counts, but it's different because it's going, oh yeah, they're not disabled because they can do what they could do before. That means that it's not if you can do what you did before, then is it a disability? And then there's the bit that I think is what needs to be expanded into, is the kinds of disabilities where you can't just put them in a mech suit or put another arm on them and make games for people in that situation.
Yeah.
Because you can have people who in a wheelchair, and you could have, there's an awesome silly clip from a mod of one of the Batman games where Batman's in a wheelchair, and it's just basically a stationary figure in the wheelchair. And so they've replaced his figure model with that, but all of the movement of the character is the same. So it's just this chair like swinging around and just beating the shit out of all the enemies around him. And it looks ridiculous, but it's one of those things where you go, well, what would happen if Batman did lose both his legs or whatever? There's so much opportunity for, because there's the stereotype is that disabled people have nothing to do. There's nothing they can do. There's nothing they want to do. All they want to do is just not be disabled. And that's just not true.
No, it's not.
There's so
It's
much.
based on an
There's
assumption.
yeah, and and that just, I haven't seen anywhere where that has been fully mined for what it can be.
Yeah, definitely. I want to touch on something you tapped into, Matt, when you talked about prosthetic limbs being like enabling people to not be disabled anymore. It's really interesting that you said that, because that taps right into, and I'm not saying that you have this point of view, you're just saying this is what games do. It taps right into something I talk about when, in my current job, I talk a lot about the medical model of disability. When an individual is medicalised and tried to be fixed and cured, within that model, a lot of people talk about the benefit of assistive technology, and prosthetic limbs are assistive tech because they're enabling people to do something they wouldn't be able to do without it otherwise. And then if you take that right to its next conclusion, you would say, well, that means they're not disabled anymore. But actually the truth is that they still have to live with their condition and manage it. They still have to manage, like phantom pain, or, having to manage the prosthetic, taking it off, putting it back on, and managing any stumps that they might have or whatever. And, outside of using that prosthetic limb, they've got to manage that. So, yes, the assistive technology is very good for enabling independence, and in the game's case, perhaps, enabling certain abilities and effects. But it doesn't take away or erase that disability. So that's a really interesting point that you touched on there, Matt.
This makes me think about the idea of sort of colourblindness when it comes to race, because that's something that we've moved away from now. This idea that, I don't see colour is outdated now, because we have recognised that race and skin colour and all that goes with that is a lifelong, well, generations long impact. And it can't just be sort of washed away, really.
Yeah.
It can't just be ignored like that, because it does have an effect. And I think what we're seeing perhaps here is a similarity to that, this idea that because we don't like it, do we, as human beings? We don't like the discomfort. We don't like the fact that somebody else is having, maybe has a tough time. We don't want to think about people's stumps underneath their prosthetic limbs, or the fact that their lives are harder because of the disability that maybe when we interact with them is not present, but then we don't see them in their home environment dealing with all of that. And I think we're getting a greater understanding when it comes to emotional and mental health, that how somebody presents in public might then mean that they need to take 2 days in bed to recover. And I think we need to maybe be thinking along similar lines with physical disability, that just because somebody manages to get around with their augmented tech or augmented tech, they're with their tech and things like that, doesn't mean that they're not disabled, and doesn't mean that they don't still have challenges in their day-to-day lives. And also, I mean, I follow a guy on Instagram who's basically had, well, everything sort of from the waist down, I think, and he was given prosthetic limbs. And he had a condition that meant that he sort of progressively lost his legs. And he was given prosthetic limbs, and he never got on with them. He doesn't use them. He uses a chair, or he gets around on his arms, and he's living a very full life. But it's
not the solution.
It's not without its issues.
And it's exactly, Jem. But it's definitely one to think about, isn't it? With that in mind, what examples of disability in games have you encountered, if any? What do these tell you about perceptions of disability?
I think the prosthetic limb thing is probably it's the most common, because it's the simplest thing to just go, oh, his arm's gone. Oh no, what's he going to do now? He's out of the game entirely. And they give him this new arm, and then they're off. So in Solid 5 and in Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, like, oh no, your soldier's had lost an arm, that means he can't be a soldier anymore. And then they just stick the arm on. And that you made me think of that, because I was going to say, like, diversity, like skin colour and gender and sexuality, is actually easy to implement. Nothing structurally needs to change, you just need to have different individuals there. With the diversity of disabled people, everything needs to change. Everything needs to be different. You can't just you can't have like right, we've got a scene in this tower block, and we've got to have someone in a wheelchair there. Then you go, oh, okay, well, how did they get in there? How are they going to get out of there? And they go, we'll just put them in a mech suit and it'll be fine. We'll just do that. Rather than taking the mindset of that. And again, I'm sure you've touched on this a lot, and you've mentioned it before, the perception of disabled people as they don't have anything to offer. They're just there to be cared for and pitied. Rather than, you can take, say, for example, someone who, if you take in the real world, if you lose your arm, there are a billion ways to lose a limb, all different kinds of, you could pull someone from a burning building and your arm gets stuck. You could be doing a trick on your skateboard and land on a fence or whatever. Any number of things. And that, the story of how that happens, and the story of how you recover after that, and then go on with your life once you've come to terms with that, that is such a rich area for creating a character.
Yeah.
If you're doing something, having someone who needs to they need to wear this artificial limb for their work or whatever, but they hate it, and they phantom pain's such a fascinating thing to consider. Of the, like, you can your body still has the neural pathways that are telling you that your arm's there, and it's still painful. And so when game designers think about including something that could be considered disabled, they're immediately thinking, all right, how do we make them be able to behave as if they're not disabled? We get the initial shock of going, oh no, an arm's missing, and then, oh, but we've got this new cool toy, and then we could go on killing things. And it's just, yeah, probably the best example of prosthetic limb, being based in the story as well, is Barrett in Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
Because they've done a really good job with the character development of all the characters in those games, and they chose fantastic voice actors from them as well. And start off, you just see this massive black guy with a massive cannon on his arm, and you think, oh, that's awesome. He must, whatever. You have no idea what that's from, but you just assume he's just this big, hard guy, and it's just a cool thing that he's got. And then you find out that, so spoiler alert for Final Fantasy VII, you find out that when years before, so he's an eco-terrorist now. That's what the story is the Shinra is mining all of the planet's natural resources, and he's leading the terrorist group that you're part of to try and bring them down. And you find out that years previously he lived in this mining town, and the mining town was going under because they were mining for coal. And he was the one that convinced the town to let Shinra come in and install a new beautiful reactor using and you go, obviously that's not going to go well, but he's the one who talked them into it. And then the reactor exploded, and he had to run into town to try and help people. And Shinra, he was there, and Shinra came and were killing all of the villagers because they needed to make sure that no one found out about what had happened. And Barrett goes in there with his best mate, and his best mate falls off a cliff, and they're all under fire. And Barrett's holding on to his arm as the guy is suspended over this cliff, trying to pull him up. And see the bullets going. Someone with a gun is shooting towards them, and the bullets come closer and closer and closer and closer, and then shoots his arm off, and his friend drops to his apparent death. And then you imagine, you see Barrett having that thing on his arm the entire time. You go, God, can you imagine how heavy that arm must feel? You feeling your friend holding onto your friend's hand. You can still feel his hand in your grip, and it's not just a neutral thing. You're going, it's just a weapon of destruction. And you go, that's what can be done. That's the kind of richness that you can have with disabled characters. And so that really touched me when I played it.
Yeah. What about you, Jem? Oh, I think you're muted still.
Sorry. I really struggled with this when I was thinking about it, because I very few games came to mind, or characters came to mind. George in Stardew Valley was probably the first one, because he's sort of a cantankerous old man in his wheelchair. But obviously you can't play him, and you can't play that character. There there was a game, and I was trying to recall it, but there was a game that I played where it was a similar graphics to Stardew Valley, those little pixelated ones, and you could choose to have your character in a wheelchair. And I think that's the first time that I'd actually had that as an option. And I've been really intrigued by the fact that it's only very recently that you can add any kind of prosthetics or any like hearing aids and things in The Sims and
That's
things
right.
like games like that. So yeah, I did really struggle, and as I said, when I sort of like went searching for it, what I came up with was a long list of characters who have various mental health struggles and disabilities. But as I said, I think that's because it's easier to write in, and I think Matt makes this really good point about the fact that it's, if you have a character who just goes on with it all as normal but happens to have a disability, then that's a sort of, ableist washing of their disability. And so if you want to then write the disability into the story, then that complicates it more. But if it was done from the start, that wouldn't, that would be fine. And we know from the fact that we have the Paralympics, we know that there are already many scenarios where a set of guidelines has been put in place to deal with the sort of very personal nature of disability, that it's not, aren't easy, aren't simple categories that you can put people into with disabilities.
That's very true.
And that's already been, that's already been tackled, so there's no reason why we couldn't do this within the game world. So I think there is a lot of opportunity within gaming for a lot of interesting and fun experiences around, exploring this sort of diversity of humanity. And I think you made a really good point earlier, Alex, when you said often in these environments and these worlds, you would see a lot of people with disabilities, because you're usually playing in quite dangerous settings. So that's one thing. And I think the other is that we've talked in the past about how gaming gives us insight, gives us opportunity to walk in somebody else's shoes and explore another perspective. And this is an excellent opportunity for able-bodied people to get some sort of insight into what it might be like to be disabled, and for disabled people to be able to play a character that's like them or similar.
Yeah, definitely. What's interesting also is when I tried to think of answers to that question as well, I had a difficult time. But they're mostly NPCs or companion characters that aren't playable. Like, I think I talked about this in previous episodes on the pod, but one that sticks in my mind is from the Barbie Detective series. You've got Barbie's friend Becky, who is wheelchair using Barbie, who has her snazzy laptop that does all the crime solving, the crime computer. But they don't obviously explore her life, her day-to-day life, because her role is to be there with the crime computer and help solve the crimes, which is good in some ways. But also, if you were to make a multi-layered story version of Barbie Detective, which would be a pretty cool game, let's be honest. If you were to delve into those stories, that would be a really cool one to look into as well. But then also that made me think, how many of these characters are your token disabled person Which brings me on to the next question. What common tropes mean for bad disability representation, do you think?
I think there's quite a lot, actually. When I started sort of thinking about this, I made some notes, because it just kind of, yeah, it's quite stereotypical. It's the motivating factor for the villain.
Yes.
That's probably the most obvious scenario. Or it's the terrifying nature of the villain. You know, they have some visible disfigurement that makes them scary, or they have some other form of disability that makes them horrific in some way
they could
within the
be-
game.
They could be quite insane or crazy. That's often a big reason behind villainous intent, isn't it? So,
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's one thing that often the villains, and if not, then it's like, oh, they're so inspirational. You know, it's like they manage to do this thing, so they inspire you. I mean, one character that I liked was in Elysium, Disco Elysium.
Oh yes, yeah.
Because he's got memory loss, and he's an alcoholic, an addict of some sort, and has severe depression and various other things going on, and hears voices. So, you know, his mental health is definitely debilitating, and he's neither of these things. He's not, you know, that the mental health issue for him, the disability for him is sort of just part of his personality. It's not the root cause of his story. Well, I mean, I haven't finished the game, so maybe it becomes, you know, because there is a feeling that perhaps it's all just a dream. But I think, you know, even within the world that you're playing within, it's consistent. So yeah, and then obviously you mentioned about the token representation and this idea of like, oh well, we're ticking that
box.
Yeah.
Oh. What are your thoughts, Matt?
The common thing of it's a bad thing that is inflicted upon an NPC. And so a classic example of that is Batgirl in the Batman universe as Joker shot her in the spine, and she was Batgirl. She was doing all the stuff that Batman and Robin and that lot were doing, and now she can't walk. She's paralyzed from the waist down, and her main thing is she's a computer whiz. Like, so that's another trope of people in wheelchairs, them being technical wizards.
How odd.
Yeah, and one thing that frustrates me a lot is the misuse of mental illness and misunderstanding of what mental illness is. Because first thing, I have not all things that people are they want to see necessarily represented all over the place.
Yeah.
So as someone with anxiety and depression, it's those things are rooted in self-criticism, and so when they are, and it's also, and that criticism of themselves is going, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, you're just lazy or weak or stupid, all the messages that come with those things. And so it's very easy to go, oh, the way you're feeling is, it's just normal, everyone feels like this, you're just reacting to it like this because you're weak, lazy, etc., etc. And so it's very hard to represent them and actually capture them in an interesting and genuinely impactful way. And then there are things like the film The Joker, where it's just the non-disabled person's idea of a disabled person, the person who doesn't have mental illnesses, coming up with this ridiculous extreme fantasy version and going, oh, we want it to be like realistic and grounded, and having him just be this delirious just caricature, and then them going, oh yes, it's amazing, it's art, it's real amazing stuff. And the only place to do it, I think Senua's Sacrifice obviously did an incredible job, and that was with schizophrenia. You're not in command at any like, you can, Senua's got this task she's doing, but she is rendered completely incapacitated at multiple points along it, and they feel organic. It doesn't feel like, because you can't turn it on and off. You can't turn mental illness's impact on and off, but you can use that impact like they do in Senua's Sacrifice. And then what you can't do is go into a sequel and then go, oh yeah, she doesn't have that anymore. She's just got these interesting voices in her head, and then no other impact of it whatsoever. It's just utterly rubbish. So the misuse and the mischaracterization of mental illness is particularly frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. It's the abled lens, so to speak. Yeah.
I liked able washing, Jam.
Yes, that's another
That is a
thing as
great
well.
phrase.
Yeah, definitely. I want to head towards the ideas of what makes good disability representation. And if you can't think of any games that you've played with good disability representation, what sorts of games would you like to see in the future that feature that, or that maybe feature a disabled protagonist or a disabled led story? Big question, I know, but yeah.
I just want the richness
There's
of
so much
experience
potential
that can
for
come.
so many different stories, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, and it takes imagination and investment, because there are, and especially as the Unreal Engine have just released their latest State of Unreal, where they did
Did you see it?
and yeah, I'm trying to. I don't know what to do about watching Witcher stuff at the moment. I think
apparently it's not gameplay because it's a tech demo, so I'd say not to watch it.
Nah. I think I'm in a place with it where you just go, it's better to just not look and wait for it to come, because if I'm waiting for new updates on it, then it'll take even longer to come out. But at any rate, Unreal Engine, you can do literally, there is no limits to it in terms of technical stuff.
Foliage nails.
Yeah, it's fucking ridiculous, stupid, new, crazy words that are gonna and in the next 10 years, it's gonna get even more incredible. So there are no excuses for lack of creativity, and that means that anything that you can imagine can be done. But because no one's done this kind of stuff yet, people don't think it can be done, and it takes something. Senua's Sacrifice shows that you can center someone with a severe disability and have an extraordinary experience from the point of view of that character, playing as that character. And that's really a daunting thing to try and make something of, when it's much easier just to take a game template and make it a shooter or a fighter or whatever. So yeah, I want to find and it just comes down to good writing as well. You need to create a character, and then it doesn't matter what happens to that character. You want to continue finding out what happens, because people's lives don't stop when they acquire a disability. Again, that's another trope of going, oh, now they're just wheelchair ridden or bed ridden, rather than going, oh yeah, they were doing this thing before. What would happen to your beloved character? What would happen to Kratos if he had both his legs chopped off? Or Batman if he had his legs chopped off. Having your legs chopped off is a very blunt idea of what a disability might be. But you just take something as again, I'll just say it's simple. Obviously that's not simple. Just go from there. And the idea that people don't think, oh, it's not going to happen to me because I'm me.
Yes.
And you're going, it wouldn't happen to Batman because he's Batman. That would never happen, even though Batman gets his back broken at one point and then, of course, recovers from it in a cave somehow and goes back to normal. But yeah, just and again, it's a recognition of the value and substance of disabled people. Going, they have just as much to offer, and it's just in a different way.
Exactly.
And that's what I want.
Well said. Any thoughts?
I did a web search on this issue, and what came up was a long list of indie games that have explored disability in a more
expansive way?
positive light, and engaged within the story. And I haven't played them, so I can't really vouch for them one way or another. But I think the fact that it's indie games that are doing this, as opposed to the sort of AAA games, is an issue in itself. Is tells us something about it. But I think we're also seeing a shift away from the sort of AAA games towards this broader game developer world. And I think that is something that is only going to get faster and more prevalent with AI coming on board, because it can help people get their ideas into actual products that they can take to somebody and get produced and get on the market. So I think it will come, but I don't think that it is there yet. There are some characters who I think have been done quite nicely, but we've already talked about a lot of those. So I think what I would like to see is characters who have, for whom their disability is 100% a part of who they are, but it isn't all that they are, and it isn't able washed away. It needs to be a realistic representation, and in order to achieve that, they need to bring in people who have experienced disability, who have knowledge of what it's like to live day in, day out with a disability. So I'm really hoping that'll happen, and we're always pushing for more diversity in the games industry, and that's one of the reasons why we think that's so important.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Jem. I think you've raised a really good point with it being perhaps more prevalent within the indie sector of gaming. I think in a way it's actually a really good fit for disabled-led stories to be within the indie sphere, as it were, because disability is a marginalised group, and indie is kind of the place where lots of other people go to share stories of their lived experience, and where you will find games that tell those stories. So in a way, I think it is fitting for at least it to start getting bigger there. And I think actually indie games can be more accessible it does depend on obviously how accessible games are as a whole, and that varies widely from game to game. In the second part of this two-parter, I'll be talking about a particularly recent release, which does have a protagonist who you could argue is disabled, but the game itself isn't the most accessible that I've played, I don't think. So I'd like to talk about that in the next episode. But yeah, I think it's really interesting how I definitely think that it's getting better, as you say, and that I'd keep your eyes on the indie space for games that tell these stories a bit more. They're usually a lot more fun stories, and they're in short little bursts as well. So in a way that makes them accessible as well. If you don't have a lot of time for various reasons, or you only can play in short chunks, then that's definitely somewhere to look. But thank you both so much for deliberating on this topic. It's brilliant to revisit it with you both. And I look forward to the second part where we're going to be talking all about To a T, which came out just earlier this month. Or in fact, it might have been at the end of last month, but it was very recent. So we'll look forward to that. And thank you so much for watching and listening. And we'll have another episode next Thursday. All right. Bye.